In the last couple of videos I've made, I've been taking on this idea of the object, picking up again, as I mentioned before, on Mark Johnson's quotation that meaning and thought emerge from our capacity for perception, object manipulation, and bodily movement. And I wanted to start with this idea of the object as a source of meaning and as a source of thought, really, because it seems to me that it's a nice simple starting point. But what I wanted, and there's a lot to be said about objects, and I do want to talk more about objects and how objects feature within thought. But I want to move on to the second part of the Mark Johnson quotation to talk a little bit about perception, because I want to lay down these ideas first, to do with objects, to do with perception, to do with bodily movement, and then a little bit about capacity or space, before I move into a more thoroughgoing analysis, I suppose, or thoroughgoing use of those terminologies, use of those features, to think what thought and meaning actually, how they actually structure themselves using those capacities. And in a sense, I won't be able to talk about perception, which is where I want to go on to next, perception. I can't do that without bringing in some of the material that I've already used to talk about objects. Because, of course, when we talk about objects, we're talking about our perception of objects. If I talk about the shape of an object, I'm talking about its visible shape or its tactile shape. If I'm talking about its resilience, its hardness or its softness, I'm talking about the haptic responses it makes when I squeeze it. If I talk about the weight of an object, inevitably I'm talking about the pressure that I'm feeling on my hands and my joints as I try to lift it. So I can't detach, of course, the idea of the object from my perception of that object and my sensory motor engagement with that object, which is absolutely the way it should be. As I say, these things are just approaches to an area of interest, more than being completely segregated categories. But this thing to do with perception, which is where I want to get into here. When I'm talking about perception, I'm really talking about sensory motor engagement, and I'm talking about the variables that exist within the possibilities of sensory motor engagement. And those variables come out of the senses. And we seem to be equipped with, and I say seem to be because I think there's a lot to be said about that, but we do seem to be equipped with a range of different sensory modalities. We can smell things, we can taste things, we can touch things, we can see things, we can hear things. We have this kind of proprioceptive sense which enables us to locate our bodies in space and locate the relationships between our bodily parts. So we do have these different sensory modalities, and implicit in those sensory modalities, and perhaps definitive of them in many ways, are the different kinds of qualia, I suppose, different conscious experiences of those sensory modalities. So we experience fluctuations in the wavelengths of light, for example, as these things called colours, or we experience fluctuations in the compression waves that we call sound as variations in that sound, perhaps tones in that sound. There's no absolute necessity why it should map in that particular way. It should be perfectly possible for variations in sonic compression waves to be experienced as different colours. And indeed, some synesthetes do have that kind of experience, but we do understand these effects, these physical experience, these physical material qualities of the outside world, as those particular variables within sensory experience. So the differences in reflected wavelength of light we experience as colours, for example. But in terms of these sensory modalities providing opportunities for meaning and thought to be conceived of, or to be constructed, to become available to us, they have to provide structure, and that structure has to be complex, it has to be predictable, and it has to be interrelated. And I think we do see that with the various sensory modalities. and that's something that I'll be exploring in later videos, but I just want to lay the groundwork for it here. And each of those sensory modalities has these different organized, structured, logical variables, and there are also relationships between the sensory modalities, which again provide structure for meaning and thought to attach itself to, or to develop, evolve out of, I suppose. So, for example, in terms of vision, there's a very particular range that vision operates within. I have this experience of seeing, and that operates within very particular kind of bands of light intensity. It also operates within very particular bands of wavelengths of light, between red on the one hand and violet on the other, broadly speaking. And once we get past those wavelengths, they're off beyond the horizon of my ability to detect them. But within that range of light that is available to my sense for sensory engagement, there is an organized spectrum. It is logical. The spectrum never appears in other orders. For example, red is always followed by orange, which is always followed by yellow, which is always followed by green, and so on. So there's a highly organized system of phenomenological experience of light that we experience as colors, for example. To stay with seeing for a moment, the way that seeing works, just according to the simple laws of optics, demand that things which are further away from me appear smaller than things that are closer to me. So, as many of you may have done this as a teacher, as a pupil at school, I would do this with my fingers and say that the teacher's head was this big. It's a trick of the light, and it's a trick of optics, and that's a very consistent trick. The closer my teacher's head would come to me, or the closer an object come to me, the wider I have to move my hands. So that again, there's an organized, structured system there which arranges experience in a very, very particular way. And many other things to do with seeing. Simple things such as, for example, if I stand up I can see further than if I'm sitting down. If I'm on the top of a hill I can see further than if I'm at the bottom of the hill. If it's cloudy I can see less than when it's not cloudy. If it's dark I can see colours less clearly than if it's not dark, and so on. Again, very, very consistent, very coherent structures. And the same thing applies to hearing. Hearing as a completely different set of phenomenologically organizing systems. Hearing isn't, or sound I suppose, isn't attached to objects in the way that colours are attached to objects. It seems to be emitted by objects, for example. It seems to fill the space and seems to enclose you in the way that visualized objects don't. So there are distinct differences, but at the same time, sound has its own logic. It has its own structure. Sound gets quieter when it moves further away, or when the source of that sound is moves further away. Objects that move past you change their tone with Doppler shift. Sounds can co-occur. You can have two sounds together and often make a third sound, and so on. So again, it's a completely organized, completely structured system, highly predictable in many ways. And the same goes again, I'm not going to go through all of the sensory modalities. The same goes again for touch, the same goes for taste, the same goes for proprioception. And also the interrelationships between these are very, very interesting, and again, usually predictable. If you can see an object, if I have an object on the table in front of me and I can see it as a particular shape, if my eyes are giving it a particular shape, then my hands will usually give it the same shape. If there's a cube here and I look at the cube and then I touch the cube, the tactile information I'm getting from my hands will map onto the visual experience I'm getting through my eyes. So there's a very, very consistent relationship between these different sensory modalities. And along with what I'm going to go on to talk about, which is understanding of space and understandings of bodily movement, together these, according to Johnson at least, these provide the framework for an understanding of meaning and thought. So the basic templates through which the conceptual content, meaning and thought, can emerge are the highly perceptual content of the senses, and how that content arranges itself and relates to itself. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.